China. Here stand thousands of castles known as Diaolou. Each castle tells a story of great suffering and bitterness. The heroes of these stories made for a legendary group of people who shared the name Jinshanke, the Gold Mountain Seekers. Discover China embarks on a quest, seeking the forgotten dream of Diaolou.
I received your letter yesterday, and I heard you were taken ill in your journeys. I'm very worried, being unable to accompany you. We can only hope you arrive safe and sound. Father and mother are both in good health. Our two young brothers went to school in Linnan. Our little daughter has begun to speak. She really likes the toys, shoes, and clothes you have sent her. Our parents miss you a lot. They asked me to enclose the 2 letters in my letter to you. Did you get them? If you did, please reply as soon as possible.
This letter, written over 70 years ago, was sent to a Chinese laborer in America from his hometown in Kaiping. In the local archives of Kaiping, there are still several hundred letters to Chinese laborers in America. Most of the authors of these letters have since passed away, leaving these precious writings behind, which tell stories of the love of separated couples. Turmoil and chaos of the war, several generations of people left their hometowns amid bloodshed and tears in the pursuit of a better future. They experienced unspeakable hardships and bitterness. There were some who tasted glory. They were the ones who brought back not just wealth, but also a miracle in the history of rural architecture in China. This is a village in Kaiping, in the mid-south of Guangdong province. The rural scenery is charming in the sunshine, the bamboo forest swaying in the wind, the pastoral village, the flowing river, and the lush rice paddies. This is a typical southern Chinese town. It is impossible to imagine that such a peaceful place was witness to turbulent times and difficult hardships. During the years of Emperor Jiajing in the Ming Dynasty, wars broke out frequently. People were living in a continuing state of unrest. In order to protect their families and neighbors, a family named Guan had built a giant shelter, calling it the Yinlong Castle. In Chinese, Yinlong literally means welcoming the dragon. Looking like multi-story towers, these fortresses are called Diaolou, a Chinese castle. Diaolous have been in existence since the days of the Han Dynasty. Yinlong Castle is a tall building, 3 stories high, It faces south and occupies an area of 152 square meters. On each corner of the structure stands a guard tower. This structure is simple, yet solid. The oldest Diaolou still standing, Yanlong Castle, protected the villagers from countless floods. It was thus called the life-saving tower. From the very beginning, the tower carried with it the villagers' dream of a peaceful life. Many years later, thousands of Diaolou have been built in rural Kaiping. Each building tells a different story of suffering and bitterness. The heroes of these stories share the name Jinshanke, meaning Gold Mountain Seekers.
We boarded a ship. The journey took us half a year to complete. It all depended on the weather. We had only salty shrimp paste to flavor our food. Over time, the shrimp paste bred worms. Our beards grew long, and by the time we reached the shores, our eyes had grown deep, dark circles. The waves were as high as mountains. Many people were unable to bear the waves. They clung to the masts, crying all the way from Hong Kong to San Francisco. When we finally reached the shore, it was as if we had landed in another world.
In the mid-19th century, gold was discovered in California. Soon the Central Pacific Railroad was under construction. The news that they were recruiting Chinese laborers spread quickly in Siyi, in the area of Kaiping. Siyi is close to the South China Sea. In the mid-16th century, some Kaiping people, in a spirit of adventure, took a barge to southeastern Asia, hoping to make a life there. The sea that has brought them wealth and opportunity inevitably separated them from their families. Countless Kaiping men bid farewell to their families and boarded ships. They were in search of a brighter future for their families and themselves.
We arrived in America. Nothing was like what we had imagined. Searching for gold, we found ourselves in the mountainous west for years. We did the hardest work, mining for tin ore, laying the lands and planting crops, treading carefully through the narrow mountain paths to build the railways.
On May 10th, 1869, the last of the railroad was laid at Promontory, Utah, marking the completion of the first transcontinental railroad in America. Afterwards, many Chinese laborers took the train to different parts of America to look for work. Jinshanke, the nickname for those who went to search for gold in California, became the common name for all overseas Chinese from Kaiping. By the early 20th century, Siyi became the famous hometown for overseas Chinese. By and by, the lives of their families improved. Many overseas Chinese returned with wealth and fame. They spared no effort to build themselves comfortable homes, utilizing the architectural knowledge and skills they had learned abroad. However, the joyful times proved to be short-lived. The Kaiping people's dreams were soon shattered by reality. Bandits had been running rampant in Kaiping since ancient times. In chaotic China of those years, the wealthy lives of returned overseas Chinese soon fell victim to disaster. In the countryside of Kaiping, it was not an uncommon occurrence for returned overseas Chinese and their families, as well as those soon to return, to be kidnapped and blackmailed by ruthless bandits. Their hard-earned wealth vanished overnight. Some families were reduced to ruins. To free themselves from this nightmare, many committed suicide. In the early 20th century, over Kaiping's 1,659 square meters, many Diaolou were built. Most of them were built with financial contributions by overseas Chinese who returned home. Unable to bear the harassment of the bandits, the Gold Mountain Seekers fought back with the help of the Diaolou.
July 3rd, at dusk, bandits surrounded the village. At night, the bandits attempted several times to force the gates open and dig holes through them, but they were beaten off. They then set fires to the haystacks outside the village. Diaolou villagers fired at them with long barrel guns and handguns. Bandits did not raise their heads and were soon under attack.
Most Diaolou are 4 or 5 stories high, the highest being 9 stories. People did not live in Diaolou in peaceful times. They were shelters against bandits, so the interiors of these Diaolou were small. The windows were narrow and protected by iron blinds and bars. The only way out of a Diaolou was through its gate. The gates were made of a thick steel plate. On the back were 3 to 4 steel locks, making the gate strong and solid. On the front of some of the gates, sliding iron windows were installed. They served as an opening to fire guns and arrows through. Any bandit who got close to a gate would be in grave danger. The Diaolou built by returned overseas Chinese were made of reinforced concrete purchased overseas. Their walls were thick and sturdy. Light firearms were unable to penetrate the almost 50-centimeter thick outer walls. There were archer slits carved into the walls of each of the Diaolou's floors. Some Diaolou were built with square or round towers on their 4 corners and functioned as watchtowers. In the corner towers, villagers could watch and defend themselves against enemies intruding into their villages. One afternoon in 1922, more than 10 uninvited visitors appeared on the path of Khan. As night fell, the gang began their attack. They charged into the Kaiping Middle School and kidnapped the principal and several students. Elated at their triumph, the bandits marched their hostages through the village of Ying. the guards on duty found them on the top of the Hongyi Tower. They sounded the alarm to the villagers. The villagers rushed to chase and corner the bandits. The bandits ran away, greatly confused, leaving their bewildered hostages behind. It created a great sensation all over Kaiping. The news also spread overseas. Soon, overseas Chinese were purchasing firearms and ammunition to help the people in the villages. The villagers raised money to build Zhongren Tower, which means everybody's tower. They also built tall night towers in the opening, so that they could effectively communicate with each other and coordinate their defense against the bandits. For people in Kaiping, it was a time of great insecurity, but also of great miracles.
Dear Mother, it has been 2 years since I left. We can't see each other because of the war. I will come home as soon as the war ends and reward you for raising me.
At the end of the 19th century, with the end of the gold rush and the frenzy of the railway construction, the Chinese exclusion policy was adopted by the US and Canada. Many gold mountain seekers, in light of such policies, had to live alone abroad, separated from their families. Those overseas Chinese from Kaiping who couldn't settle down to build their families abroad pinned their hopes on raising their families in their hometown. The money they made was for the hope of returning to China, marrying, buying a piece of land, and building their own homes. The Diaolou and Kaiping were not only shelters against bandits, the overseas Chinese who returned wanted not just security, but beauty as well. They spared neither effort nor resource in order to build exquisite Diaolou. In some villages, luxurious ornate villas called lu began to appear. These delicate, elegant buildings were the crystallization of the dreams of several generations of overseas Chinese. To help them build their houses, they employed expert architects from home and abroad and many local rural craftsmen. In the 1940s, with the lifting of the Chinese Exclusion Act after the Second World War, many family members of those overseas Chinese immigrated abroad. The Diaolou, which their ancestors had spent much of their hard-earned money and effort, which have served and protected them over all of these years, were abandoned. As the years passed, the Diaolou have lost their glory and fell into disrepair. Some became nothing more than ruins. The Jinshanke, who traveled abroad from China's coastal rural area, exposed themselves to foreign culture. The names of Diaolou and the couplets and frescoes on them were an embodiment of the Jinshanke's cultural growth. The returned overseas Chinese constructed and decorated their homes after their own fashion in order to provide their families a safe and stable shelter. But behind this comfortable life was a bitter and harsh history of their life struggles. The men went abroad to earn money. They seldom came home. Some never returned since they could not afford the expense of the trip back. The women who stayed behind were separated from their husbands. Many had to adopt children and lived in bitter loneliness for the rest of their lives. The overseas Chinese took abroad with them the musical instrument yangqin, a hammered dulcimer from their hometown. When they missed home, they would play the yangqin. They kept in touch with their family by letters crossing the vast oceans. Over the years, people staying at the Diaolou and those traveling abroad looked to each other in desperate yearning. For those overseas Chinese, the Diaolou and the villages in their hometown were signs in their dream of coming back home.
Vui chan ngàn hậu thay bị tu thần thay tham han cu an yêu ca yak nan phan lu nim thân yen chiang po han na vi si yang yi kin si nan.
Today, most of the Diaolou in Kaiping are empty. For the overseas Chinese of Kaiping, the Diaolou are symbols of their hometown and their attachment to Kaiping. The Diaolou are records of the lives of several generations of overseas Chinese. The Diaolou of Kaiping, Guangdong, are engraved in the memory of China's modern history.